use GPS when you drive? Yeah. How many of you, and here's the thing, since just the world decided to move to our humble little city, I just put GPS on almost all the time if I'm driving anywhere outside of Round Rock, because I know, like today, 35 gets shut down, right? Some of you are walking in right now because the freeway was shut down. I'm always just putting GPS on because it's like, you know what, I don't have to think about it, and I don't have to get stuck in traffic. How many of you wonder, though, as you put GPS on, like, is this really going to take me to where I'm supposed to go? Anybody ever wonder that? There was a family a week ago in Hawaii. Maybe you heard about this. They were tourists. They were driving, and they drove into the harbor. I think we have a photo of it. Can we pull up that photo? They were following the GPS, and the GPS just took them right into the harbor. The lady goes, I looked at the thing, and I looked up, and we were literally in the water, and we just couldn't brake. Now, nobody died. Everyone was okay. Though some locals swam over and rescued them from their car. But the look on her face is just classic, right? She didn't know where she was going, and she wasn't really paying attention. Now, listen, getting lost is bad, but drowning is worse, right? I mean, of the two, it's much worse. And here's the reason we're in this series on enough. Because for some of us, but perhaps maybe for many of us, you'd say in this season, I've kind of gotten lost. I've kind of gotten lost. Or maybe not in every area, but there's some areas of your life where you're saying, I just feel off. I feel off, and I want to get back on track. I want to get on the right path that God has for me. And so we've been teaching through this because sometimes we miss turns. Sometimes we try to take shortcuts. Sometimes we get into the wrong place. And just like these tourists, if we're not careful, we can get to a really sticky, detrimental situation. We can find ourselves in a place that is not good for us. It's not good for our family. It's not good for those around us. And our passion as a church, our burden, our desire is to help you guys be on the right path for your life, to get on the right path and move in the right direction, and truly to end this thinking that none of us are enough. We want to end the thinking that we're not enough. And today we're going to look at the life of Moses. We've been looking at his life over these last few weeks, and we've been discovering who he is and also the reality that he was lost in his life. Sometimes we talk about people having a midlife crisis, right? And sometimes with guys, we dye our hair jet black and we go out and buy a sports car. We talk about people having a quarter life crisis, and usually we quit our career, we go become a barista in Portland, Oregon. And I lived there. I met a lot of people that had a lot of quarter life crises. Sometimes we just have an identity crisis, right? I think Moses had all three. I think he had a life crisis, an identity crisis, a quarter life crisis, and a midlife crisis, just kind of all at the same time. Moses was born into a time in life where the mandate, the rule, was to kill all baby boys of his nation that were under the age of 2. If that sounds familiar, Jesus went through the exact same thing, didn't he? So that's the world he's born into. His mom was smart. She created this craft and she sent it downstream, and the person that found him was the daughter of Pharaoh, the princess. The princess lifts him up out of the water and she brings him into his life. She eventually adopts him. And the guy that said, I want all Hebrew baby boys to be killed, becomes his grandfather. He calls him Papa or Gramps or Tex or whatever grandparents go by these days, right? And he finds himself in this place of greatness. The Word of God tells us that he was gifted in speech and people followed him. He had influence. And here he is in this place. And not only is he in this place as the son of the princess, but he finds himself in this place where Pharaoh has no heir. So Moses is in line to be the next Pharaoh, the most powerful person in that entire region of the world at that time. His life was good, but his future was even better. Until Moses drives his life into the harbor, right? He follows the GPS that gets him off. He ends up murdering someone. Pharaoh, his grandfather, finds out about it, and he attempts to kill Moses himself. And so Moses does what some of us do in a situation like that. He runs away. He has a crisis, and he runs away, and he flees into the desert. He was once a someone, now he's a no one. He's literally the shepherd for his father-in-law's sheep. He can't even afford any sheep of his own. He's the shepherd to his father-in-law. And he spends 4 decades in the wilderness. He's 80 years old. The best of his life is far behind. He can't even see it in the rearview mirror. He's in the desert. He's in a place of despair, and he's believing that his life is done. And that's where I want to pick us up in this moment of Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. It says this. One day, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't this bush burning up? I must go see it. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush. He said, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Moses might have thought that his life was done, but guess what? God says it's not done. It's not over. This place where you're standing, it's holy ground. This word in the Hebrew, in the original Old Testament language, was this word that it meant that it was set apart. God says, I want you to take off your shoes because this place that you're entering into is set apart. Even more than that, he says, Moses, I'm wanting you to separate yourself from your past because now you're talking to a holy God. And when we come into his holiness, guess what? It changes everything for every one of us. Our past is our past. It's just that. God says, I'm separating you from your past. I'm calling you into a new present and a new future, the future that I have for you. And then he says, take off your shoes. God saw this moment was so holy. He didn't want anything to be between Moses and himself. He said, so take off your shoes. This moment is holy. Could I get that yellow Yeti? Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Can we make some noise for Roy? Wednesday night, he shared his story with our youth. We had 20 youth here Wednesday night. If you have a student in middle school or high school, join us for the first Wednesdays. Man, he had us all in tears, though. I was so proud of him. I was just like, man, it was so good. Exodus chapter 3, let's pick up in verse 7. It says, then the Lord told him, I've certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I've heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I'm aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Now go, for I am sending you out to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. Notice what God says to Moses. This is so powerful. I don't want to miss this. God says, I have seen, I have heard, and I have come. I have seen, I have heard, and I have come. Now listen, this is for Moses, but it's also for you. It's for every single one of you. God would say to you, I've seen what you're going through. I've heard your prayers. I've heard your cries, and I've come. I'm with you. I'm here now with you, right? God knows down to our final breath, our final day, our final hour, our final moments. He knows how long we're going to live. He knows what we're going through. He doesn't just know our present. He knows our future. He cares. He's impacted by the cries and the prayers of his people. And here's the thing. The devil wants you to think differently. The devil wants you to think that God doesn't hear you, that God doesn't see the situation you're in, what you're walking through, what you're going through, the things you're praying to him. The devil wants you to think, man, God is not hearing your prayers. And when you're praying, but God's not listening, right? John, you've been crying out for this thing, but God's not listening. Martha, I know you've been praying and fasting, but you know what? God doesn't care. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about your situation. That's the lie the enemy wants us to believe. But what we see from Moses, we see for us. I've seen, I've heard, and I've come. Here's what I believe. It's not just that God has seen, but that God will save. It's not just that I believe that God hears, but that God will help. It's not just that God says, I've witnessed this. He's saying, now I'm going to walk this out with you. I'm going to walk this out with you together. I've seen, I've heard, I'm going to help. Notice that phrase, it's all past tense, right? God's like, I'm going to get to it, right? Like, I got this list of things around my house, like the honey, help me out, honey-do list, thank you. And I got a whole bunch of stuff, and it's like, yeah, we'll get to that. My wife's like, hey, can we fix that? It's been broken for 2 years. Like, you're going to fix that during the pandemic, remember? And it's like, oh, yeah, right? God's not that way. God is on it. He's on it. He says, as a result of everything I've seen, as a result of everything I've heard, as a result of everything I've done, Moses, I have chosen you. I've chosen you to be the one. Moses, you're my guy. You're the one I've chosen. And you think Moses would just be flattered by that? You think Moses would be overwhelmed? He'd be encouraged, like, wow, God chose me. But he doesn't believe it. Listen to this. But Moses protested to God. Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people out of Egypt? Like, you know that moment when you're so overwhelmed, you're like, say what? Like, your voice, it just gets up there, right? Like, that's Moses in this moment. That's Moses in this moment. Moses knew who he was talking to. There's no denying it. Moses is talking to a bush. I mean, come on. But it's a bush on fire that's not burning up. God is speaking through this fire. He's speaking through this bush. Moses knew who he was talking to, because when God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, what does he do? He like hides his face. He's ashamed. Moses knew who he was talking to. And what happens? He responds out of his insecurities. This moment is unlike any moment in Moses' life. He's experienced amazing moments, but now God comes to him after 4 decades of living on the run, and God says, Moses, I'm choosing you. I'm choosing you to lead my people. He's already told Moses what he's going to do, right? He says, I've seen, I've heard, I'm going to act. And Moses gets stuck in his own insecurities, and he says, what? He says, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? God says, I'm calling you out. Moses, no more drifting. Moses, no more living in the desert. Moses, no more despair. Moses, listen, you're not going to lead your father-in-law's flocks anymore, because you're going to lead my people. I'm calling you to a higher purpose, a higher role. I'm upgrading you in life. I'm promoting everything about you. And Moses misses it. It's like he just wants to go back to the canal, back to the harbor. Like, let me just go, drive back into the water. God says, I'm pulling you out, and I'm using you to liberate my people. What do we see? We see that Moses has incredible insecurities. He's not alone, is he? He's not alone. Backstage, right before I walk out, I'm dealing with those insecurities. I'm giving those insecurities to God, right? All those things that run through your mind before you walk out onto a stage. I'm dealing with those things. I mean, they're just hitting me left and right. Who am I? Who am I to stand up in front of these people and talk about Jesus? Who am I to do that? Don't raise your hand, but how many of you have been battling insecurities this morning? Before you got here, as you were walking across that parking lot, as you walked through that front door, and those insecurities, right? How many of us battle with this insecurity that we believe in the greatness of God, but that we don't believe that God could use us to do great things? We believe God is great. Moses believed God was great. He knew who he was. He hid his face from him. He takes off his shoes. He's standing on holy ground. But his insecurities got in the way. Notice how Moses responds. He responds with a question. He doesn't say, God, wow, thank you. God, I can't believe it. Okay, Lord, whatever you want, I'm going to do. Right now, let's go. I mean, that should have been his response, but he responds with a question. He responds with the question of, who am I? They say there's no dumb questions. I don't know if I believe that. I don't know if I buy into that. I also don't think that everyone should get a trophy just for participating, but that's another thing for another day, okay? So let's just say at best it's debatable that there's no dumb questions, but here's what we know. We can ask the wrong questions, can't we? We can ask the wrong questions. And oftentimes the wrong questions will lead to the wrong answers, which lead us in the wrong direction. Case in point, and humor me with this because it's a little bit far-fetched, but imagine on November 20th, 2006, I get down on a knee to propose to my wife and say, hey girl, you wanna go get some froyo? Wrong question, right? That wrong question probably would have been the end of definitely the date, maybe even the relationship, right? We can ask the wrong question, and that's the question that Moses asked. He starts with the wrong question. He starts with the question of who am I? Who am I? Who am I to do this? God, who am I? That is often the worst question that we can start with. And let me explain. You see, we struggle with this question, am I enough? Because we start with the question of who am I? We start with the question of who am I? And what that leads to is a place, a pattern, a mindset of thinking that I'm not enough. I'm not enough because I'm already starting with the wrong question, the question of who am I? There's a powerful connection between these two questions. It didn't work for Moses then, and it doesn't work for us now. Now, I believe the question of who am I is an important question every one of us should ask. And it changes in seasons. Any of you know this? Those of you that have just come out of college, the season you're in now is very different. Before, you had professors tell you where you had to be, when you had to be. They told you exactly the work that you had to do. But now, you might have a boss, but you have some freedoms. You have some directions. They're not telling you everything you're supposed to be doing. You're in a very different season. Now you're asking the question, okay, I'm a college graduate, but who am I now? Who am I now in this new place? It's a very important question, but I believe that if we start with that question, we miss so much. Now, I want to come back to the most important question, but I want to look at this quickly. How God responds. Verse 12. Listen to what he says. God answered, I will be with you. And this is your sign that I am the one who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain. God says, I'm not just giving you instruction. I'm also going to give you a sign, Moses. I'm going to calm your nerves. I'm going to give you a sign. But then listen, Moses protests. If I go to the people of Israel and I tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? Do you notice what God does here? Moses asks the question, who am I? And God doesn't answer the question. See, he doesn't have to answer our questions. He doesn't even answer Moses' question because that's not the focus. The focus is not Moses, the focus is God. That's why you're here today. That's why you're watching online today, because the focus of our lives is God. And you're here because you want to know a little bit more about God. Or you love God and you want to know even more. The focus is God himself. God does address Moses, though. And you got to catch that. You got to see that. Because again, the lie of the enemy would say, oh, God doesn't care about you. He's not going to speak to you. He's not going to meet you. He's not going to talk to you. God addresses Moses. He doesn't just kind of like, I'm going to ignore Moses and walk off. He engages Moses. He responds to Moses. He meets Moses in this moment. And God's promise to Moses is the same promise he would give you and I. He says, I will be with you. And then listen to what he says. Verse 14, God replies to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my eternal name, my name to remember for all generations. Here's the question. Here's the question that Moses should have asked. Here's the question that if we can ask in the middle of every morning, in the middle of every challenge, in the middle of every diversity, in the middle of every point where we think, I don't have enough. The question that we ask is not, who am I? It's, who are you? God, who are you? Who are you? If Moses had just started there, everything would have been different for Moses. If you and I would just start there, everything would be different for us. When we start with that, we begin to ask the question, who is God? And then we begin to review who God is. Oh my gosh, there is so much peace. There is so much comfort. There is so much joy. In the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the heartache, there is peace because we know who God is. We know that he's with us. This week I was on a phone call. Once a month I have accountability with 4 other pastors, and they're in different parts of the country, and so we gather every month just to talk and pray, and we had this prayer gathering, so I had to leave early, and they said, hey, tell us what's going on in your life, and I began to share with them the building and everything we're walking through as a church, and I began just to share a number of things we're walking through as we're just getting to just walk this season of life out. And some situations that are going on and some different things. And I finished sharing and my friend goes, are you okay? I go, yeah, like, I'm good. Why? And he goes, I'm stressed out for you. He goes, you're carrying a lot right now. And my other friend goes, he goes, Ezra, I just feel anxious right now we want to pray for you, right? But there's been this peace in this season that I've never had in my life. I've never had the peace that I get to experience right now. And there's still moments where we kind of start to freak out, but as we keep our eyes on Jesus, there is a peace that he gives. The question that we have to ask is not, who am I? It's, who are you? And over this last season, I've told you, I've been wanting to share this with you for about 5 weeks now. Over this last season, this is what God has been teaching me. As I start to look at things that feel impossible and overwhelming, it's, God, who are you? Who are you? Because you provided the first time and the second time and the 48th time and the 112,000th time. You provided. It's you, God. It's you who provided. When we start with this question, everything is different. See, when we say, who am I, what it leads to is that I'm not enough. But when we start with, who are you, we realize that we're more than enough. When we start with, who am I, it becomes insecurities based on my failures. But when we start with, who are you, there's complete security based on God's perfection. When we ask the question, who am I, it often leads to my inferiority. But when we say, God, who are you, it brings us to his superiority. Here's what you have to see. Don't let the lie of your insecurity cause you to miss out on the truth of God's superiority. Don't let the lie of what we think we're inferior in miss out on how God is and was and will always be superior. That's who he is. That is what he's done. I am who I am. Talk about a mic drop moment, right? I am who I am. It's more than just a play on words, though, church. It's more than God just getting really creative. God's saying, this is who I am. He's saying, when I identify myself, Moses, there's no equal. There's no equal to me. F.B. Meyer said it like this. He said, if you place God on one side of your symbol of equation, there is nothing to put on the other side but himself. There's nothing that goes on the other side of the equal sign because nothing is equal to God. Nothing can compare to him. Nothing can comprehend to him. The closest we have is this, and I was thinking about this, I've been researching this for a little while. The closest we have to an equivalent to say is that God is love, right? God is love. We talked about that in 1 John 4:8 and 4:16. But here's what we can't say. Love is God because it falls short. Love is not God. Only God is God. God is love. But when you reverse that, it's not the same. Nothing is equal to God. I am who I am. And if you look at this in the original language, it comes out this name of God as Yahweh. The name of God is Yahweh. And here's the thing, Yahweh is not a new name. It's mentioned 160 times prior to this moment in the Bible. In fact, Moses' mom, her name was Jochebed. If you're pregnant right now, take that name off the list, okay? It's got a great meaning. It means that Yahweh is my glory. But that's gonna be a rough name for that kid growing up, all right? A lot of wedgies, a lot of all kinds of stuff for that kid. Just scratch that name off. Here's what God's saying. When his people went into slavery, they were in slavery for 430 years. During that time, a family grew into a nation, and a nation lost sight of who God was. They began to worship all kinds of different gods in Egypt. They began to worship the God for the sun. They began to worship the God for the fall, the God for the summer, the God for the spring. They began to worship all these different gods. It sounds like some of the religions today, doesn't it? God says, all those gods are false gods. I am the only God. I am who I am. I'm the only self-existent, infinite being in all of the universe. And Moses, I'm here to dispatch you. That's who you represent. I am has sent you. I am is calling you. I am is sending you. That's who you say is sending you. But this is not enough for Moses. It's not enough for him. The answer to this question of who are you is I am. When we begin to ask the question, God, who are you? He says, I am. I am who I am. I am is with you. In your battle with cancer right now, I am is with you. In your diabetes, I am is with you. In your broken marriage, I am is with you. As you're grieving that child that walked away, I am is with you. As you can't determine the diagnosis, I am is with you. God says, Moses, I'm with you. I'm with you. I am who I am. So the question remains for us today is, how do we respond to this? How do we respond to this? What do we do with all of this? Well, I think the first thing is that we start with a different question. Who are you? Who are you? Here's the second thing. God says this statement to Moses. He says, Moses, in verse 10, what we read a few minutes ago, he says, now go, for I'm sending you. Here's what's wild about this statement. This statement only happens one other time in the entire Bible, church. In the entire Bible, this one statement only happens one other time. It's found in Genesis 37, and it says this. It says, and Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send them to you. Israel is another name for Jacob, who we read about a moment ago. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. God says, Jacob, you're more than just a man. You're going to be a leader to a nation. There's a nation forming inside of you and your sons. God says, I'm changing your name from Jacob to Israel. So this is Israel. This is Jacob. And Jacob turns to his son Joseph, and he says, Joseph, I'm sending you. I'm sending you out to your brothers. I'm sending you out to check in on them. I'm sending you out to make sure they have everything they need. I'm sending you out. This is the only other time in all of the Bible we see it with God and Moses, and we see it with Israel and with Joseph. Now, here's what's significant about this moment with Joseph. Joseph gets sent out to his brothers. His brothers were great people. They loved him so much. They hated him. When they saw him coming, they said, hey, let's kill him. There's 11 of us. I mean, we still got 11 more. We're going to be okay. They make a decision to kill their own brother. And then guess what? One of them steps in. He says, we can't kill our own brother, right? Let's just sell him as a slave. Let's just traffic him, because trafficking's better than murder, right? I mean, and so that's what he does. They traffic their brother. They sell their brother into slavery. But just like God was with Moses, God was with Joseph. Joseph gets sold to a man named Potiphar, and he ends up becoming influential. Potiphar says, everything except for my wife is yours. Potiphar's wife causes a scene and says that Joseph tried to rape her when really he ran away from her when she was attempting to seduce him. He ends up in prison. Ends up in prison for several years for something he did not do. But when he's in prison, guess what? Just like with the people of Israel, God sees, God hears, and God moves, and God frees Joseph from that jail. And in one day, he goes from a prisoner to the vice president of the nation of Egypt. And guess what God does through that? God sends a plague, not a plague, a famine. And Joseph is in this place that he positions the nation of Egypt to be the wealthiest nation on the planet. And then guess what happens? Those 11 brothers and their father and their kids and his grandkids all end up moving to Egypt because of Joseph. 18 years earlier, he's sold as a slave, and now he's the vice president, and he saves his family. He writes a new future for his family. He allows them to continue to live because of where God placed him and put him. God used Joseph, who I am sending, to bring his people into a temporary home and to save them from starvation. And then you fast forward 400 years later, and God says to Moses the exact same phrase. He says to Joseph. Now we know Moses' response. Moses' response is, who am I, right? We know that. But listen to Joseph's response. He says, here am I. Here am I. I believe that we can live one of two lives. Who am I? Or here am I? Who am I to do this for you, God? Who am I to serve you? Who am I to follow you? Who am I to lead my family or my children or this ministry or this nonprofit? Or we can say, God, here am I. Here am I. Whatever you want me to do, I'm going to do. Whatever you're asking me to say, I'm going to say. Whatever you're calling me out into, God, here am I. Here am I. Here am I. Church, that is the kind of life that God's inviting us into. That's the kind of response. So it's, who am I? Or who are you? And then our response to that question can either be, who am I? Or God, here am I. Would you bow your heads with me today? Today, I want to ask you the most important question I'll ask